years ago, on the night of November 8, 2016, Dipayan Ghosh watched stunned as the screens around him at the Javits Center in Manhattan flashed the US election results. Around 2:30 a.m., he drove out to Washington, D.C. for a morning meeting at Facebook, his employer at that time. Between then and now, Ghosh has left Facebook. We all know how the 2016 elections were, quote, zucked by Cambridge Analytica. And in October 2020, just now, US Congress has dumped a 450-pager on breaking up big tech. All this is essential background for this Sci-Fi 2020 conversation, barely 15 days before the US election. Dipayan Ghosh now is co-director of Digital Platforms and Democracy Project at Harvard Kennedy School. He joins us from Boston. Welcome, Dipayan.
Thanks so much for having me.
Facebook says it's readied new safeguards for the 2020 US elections that have it better prepared to deal with candidates who prematurely declare victory or contest official results, and so on. How should we think about corporate PR or whatever you call it this late into the election cycle? If they've done it now, they could have done it before, and so on. Over to you, Dipayan.
I think we have to recognize that Facebook, as a matter of its business model, is very much focused on promoting engagement, collecting lots of data. That's what it really cares about. That's the engine that runs Facebook. That's the thing that really produces so much profit for the financial community that's behind Facebook, including people who own stocks in Facebook and the executive board of Facebook. And at the end of the day, I think what we have to remember is that they'll do whatever it takes to protect that financial infrastructure behind the company. And I think for the time being, what that means, given the private nature of the firm, what it means is that they'll do whatever they need to do to keep regulators at bay, to keep the public sentiment at bay. And they're very responsive to pressure, but only when that pressure mounts so high that it makes commercial sense for them to do something. They're not acting on behalf of democracy, not at this stage.
Big tech's defectors have delivered some of the juiciest insights into the promise and peril of social media platforms. You're one such defector scholar. Give us an insider's view of that shiny idea of move fast and break things, where the firm is not held to account for what's broken. And also this metaphor of the platform as an empty space.
I think Facebook, when you're inside of Facebook, it feels both physically and metaphorically like a spaceship. It feels like you're walking really at the cutting edge of technology, walking right through it. I remember is not doesn't apply so much to the Washington D.C. office, which is where I was primarily based. But when you go to headquarters, you feel it. You feel all the brilliant people around you. You feel the presence of executives at the company like Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. You feel all this energy of Silicon Valley. And that goes to the physical space even that you're walking through. Fantastic new buildings and the new headquarters of the company. But at the same time, we have to remember what really allowed Facebook to take over Sun Microsystems campus and buy it, and then build two massive new buildings right next to it. It's really that engine underlying Facebook. It's that thing that, as we've talked about a little bit, really has found a way to exploit people, and I think it's time for us to seek some much needed changes.
At the core is this concern of data voodoo dolls, right? Digital profiles for each user, which are effectively an extension of yourself. If you're not paying for a product, you're the product. So when does a PR problem become a business problem?
A PR problem becomes a business problem exactly when not alleviating the PR pressure on your company means that you're leaving profit on the table, and that is I think fundamentally how Facebook currently operates. that they don't they don't undertake these kinds of policies around elections. And let's just take the U.S. election for instance, or the U.S. political context for instance. The company hesitates to do anything in the interest of democracy or safety and security in the digital media ecosystem. It hesitates because anything that it might do to curb engagement, to take a step against, let's say, nationalists or the far right, or the far left for that matter, anything like that diminishes engagement on the platform. While they might do it for PR reasons in the moment, they hesitate to get to that point time and time again because doing so essentially leaves revenue on the table. So I think what we're seeing at this moment in 2020 and in the preceding years is that the company continues to try to stave off this discussion about regulation of Facebook, regulation of the business model, privacy, competition, transparency into how the company and its algorithms work. It staves all of that off for the months and years ahead as much as possible, so that it can continue to rake in revenues at exploitative rates in the time being, and continue to contribute to its massing of market power.
After a lot of song and dance, US Congress has made a rather flimsy case for breaking up big tech in its 450-page report. You say in your book, page 241, yeah, that economic regulation is what they fear most. Could you explain?
Yeah, I think what we one of the things that we have seen with respect to Facebook, with respect to YouTube, with respect to Twitter, and some of the more fringe outlets as well, fringe platforms in the consumer internet sector. One of the things we've seen is that there's been a preponderance of what I'd call harmful or offensive content, hate speech, disinformation, conspiracy theories, recruitment of terrorists, violent conduct, etc. All of these we can all agree, I think, are in some way, shape, or form harmful to a large group of people, whether we're talking about the American context or the Indian context or the European context or whatever it might be. For the most part, I think most of us would agree that it's not great that this kind of activity is present over the internet. I think some people might say that, well, look, the internet is a place for free speech and freedom of expression, and I think we can all understand that too. But at the same time, this is all offending content, and for the most part, we don't want to see it necessarily promoted, especially if it's harming either psychologically or physically even certain classes of the population. We don't want to harm other people. I think most of us don't want to harm other people. And yet we see all of this content on places like Facebook, and I think that has triggered a conversation among policymakers, especially in places like the U.S., well, what we need to do is take all that harmful content off of Facebook. We need to find some way of either suppressing it or forcing Facebook to have some process by which it will remove that content. We need to incentivize the company to do that. We need to regulate content in this way. So many people contend this. Of course, there are counter arguments as well, and this conversation never goes anywhere because, especially in the United States, where we protect free speech, almost like it's a religion here, we cannot really find any middle ground between liberals and conservatives in this country over how Facebook should treat offensive content, hate speech coming from, let's say, white nationalists against African American populations in the United States, for example. And yet, it's the issue that politicians and policymakers focus on the most because it's the most visible, contentious issue right now. But what I mean in the book, terms of disservice, is that really we shouldn't be looking at the harmful content itself. We shouldn't necessarily be trying to take that content offline as much as we should be trying to understand why it not why it originates, but why it gets promoted by the platforms, why it goes viral. And To that end, I would point to the business model. And I would suggest that if we can truly address the business model, the commercial overreaches of the business model through economic regulation, we will suppress the vast majority of offending content as a default, because we will take away the incentive for Facebook to promote hate speech, because it will no longer be necessarily engaging for many people. That's what I mean in this particular argument in the book.
So, what might you count as an incremental victory, a reform that would really have teeth?
Transparency over platforms is both a low hanging fruit and potentially very impactful. And I think the best example at the federal level of legislation that proposes transparency measures over Facebook is the Honest Ads Act. The Honest Ads Act, it's introduced by two Democrats as well as two Republicans, one of whom is now deceased, John McCain. But it's an effort really led by Amy Klobuchar and Mark Warner, Democrats in the Senate, and they have found voices on the Republican side as well who have endorsed the bill. And basically, all it says is that all of those, in the context of political messaging, political advertising on social media, all of those restrictions, all of those regulations that apply for political advertising on other media, in other media contexts like broadcast, should apply also to political advertising in the digital context. So what does that mean? That means that people who are viewing the ad should be able to see what the provenance of the ad is, who's funding it, who's responsible for the creation of the content. And potentially, you could consider further disclosures as well, transparency-related disclosures around, what are the advertisers' targeting parameters here? What are the advertisers? What is the advertisement's existing reach? How many people will this advertisement go to in the next day, in the next 5 days? How much was spent on this advertisement? And these are the kinds of things that can really help us understand, us as consumers and citizens, understand how political advertising in the modern era works, which is so important to democracy. And Mark Warner and others were calling this a low-hanging fruit a few years ago, which I tend to agree with. And yet, this bill hasn't moved in 4 years. Why? It's largely because of lobbying from the industry. They see it as a slippery slope, that if they have to provide these disclosures over political advertisements, then there could come a day when politicians start to expand the coverage of this bill, the coverage of these measures, to all advertisements. And the moment you start engaging in that discussion, it's the end for Facebook, because then you start revealing how the algorithm works, and you start revealing how insidious the nature of targeting across lines of bias really is. And Facebook's business model starts to collapse. So again, I think it is low hanging fruit with respect to things like breakup, or with respect to things like privacy. But and yet it's a very contentious issue that hasn't moved.
Could we also think about it as this idea of consumer surplus? Eric Brynjolfsson, Avi Collis, and Felix Eggers, they've run a series of massive online choice experiments between 2016 and 2018. You may be familiar with that, where they paid people to give up Facebook And they've paid them after verifying the inactivity of their Facebook accounts. And the median consumer, we hear, was willing to do this at $48, which speaks to that consumer surplus. Now, US antitrust law has been dominated for years by this consumer welfare perspective, right? That's being challenged now with the argument that prices aren't everything. Do you want to speak to that?
I agree with this, that prices are not everything. And yet, I do think that our existing antitrust regime in certain ways in the United States can force companies to give something up, can induce more effective competition standards in the United States. Let's step back for a second and just note that the typical path for a competition policy regulator in the U.S. that might be the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission, for instance, someone who's working for the U.S. government and is responsible for maintaining competition in the marketplace. The typical path of intellectual development here is that, well, you first receive a complaint, or you decide you want to start some kind of an inquiry against a company, in the sense that someone may have complained, or you may believe that a company is causing harm because of its market power. Let's say you've received that complaint, or made this decision to launch an inquiry. You then ask, first of all, well, what is the market? Here, let's say that we can come to some definition of social media as a market. Then you might ask, well, okay, now that we know the market at play, does the company in question, the offender, does the alleged offender have a monopoly in this market and therefore market power? And in the U.S., you might suggest that a monopoly is over 50% of a market. In Europe, 40%. These are just the regulatory standards. Okay, so now we can suggest that, all right, well, Facebook probably has a monopoly in the sense maybe it has more than a 50% share of social media. Then the critical step is to ask, well, I have two proposed remedies. I have two possible remedies. One is breakup, what Senator Elizabeth Warren has suggested, for instance, what is hinted at in this House antitrust report. And you might pursue this option if you think that once you break the company up, you will see a vibrant, diverse, dynamic environment of social media companies all competing with one another. We can all have a debate as to whether or not that might be the case. But that would be the purpose of breakup, that after you break the company up, you'll have this diverse ecosystem of companies serving the market. The alternative in this intellectual debate is that, well, you know what? I don't think you as a regulator might suggest, I don't think that we will see this kind of dynamism and vibrancy in the market with a bunch of different companies all competing with one another. I think it's going to tend back towards one player. One player will all the consumers will gravitate to that one player. That one player might start to acquire other firms or shut them out of a market over time. And so, here, what you'd suggest is that, well, there's natural monopoly features here, and what we really need is the state to tell the natural monopoly that, you know what, you can't exploit the market. And to your question, I think if we follow this in either approach, what we can say for sure is that there is a monopoly here, and that monopoly, Facebook, is exploiting the market right now through consumer prices. And this requires a little bit more elaboration, but I in the interest of time, we'll just suggest that that price that they're charging is not through a subscription fee. It's not dollars coming out of our pockets, but is coming in the form of our data and our attention, which is being pulled in by the companies at an exploitative rate. and essentially they charge fair prices for it of advertisers. And yet there's tremendous exploitation on the consumer side from an economic perspective.